the virtual lobby. To those who are just joining, we're going to give it maybe another 30 seconds just to see if people are still joining, and then we'll get started. So if you've just joined, just hold tight for about 30 seconds. Okay, let's go ahead and start. Welcome to today's Quincy Institute panel, which is a Spring Offensive of Terror, ISK and TTP Violence in Afghanistan and Pakistan. My name is Adam Weinstein, and I'm a research fellow at the Quincy Institute. If you don't know about the Quincy Institute, it's a think tank that approaches U.S. Foreign policy and engagement with the world from a restraint perspective. In other words, we emphasize diplomacy and development over the kind of military intervention we've seen dominate our foreign policy over the last 20 years, especially in this part of the world. We have a great set of experts with us today to explain this unfolding situation. In no particular order, just the order I see folks. Up first, we have Dr. Asfandyar Mir, who is a senior expert in the Asia Center at the United States Institute of Peace. And previously, he was a postdoc fellow at Stanford, and he has a significant amount of expertise on terrorism in South Asia. Next up, we have Elizabeth Threlkeld, who is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. She previously served as a foreign service officer, including in Islamabad and Peshawar, Pakistan, and knows the ins and outs of U.S.-Pakistan relations quite well. We have Dr. Jonathan Schroden, who is the director of the Center for Naval Analyses, Countering Threats and Challenges program. And John, you can mention it later. I believe you're the director of another program there as well. He deployed or traveled to Afghanistan 13 times in support of ISAF and has a granular knowledge of the DoD's actions in Afghanistan and the environment, the threat environment in Afghanistan overall. And last but not least, we have Tamim Asey, who is executive chairman of the Institute of War and Peace Studies and Council on Foreign Relations of Afghanistan. He's also currently a fellow at King's College London, and he's served in various departments of Afghanistan's previous government. So when I organized this panel, I have to say things are so kinetic and so fluid in Afghanistan and Pakistan that I had to keep updating the landing page. And the second I posted the landing page, it was basically already outdated. Today alone in Pakistan, we had a Baluch separatist movement, BLA, that attacked Chinese nationals in Karachi. And we're not going to go too deep into that, but we also had an assassination on a former JUIF candidate in Pakistan by the Islamic State. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen ISK attacks all over Afghanistan. We've seen TTP attacks in Pakistan. A little over a month ago, there was an ISK attack at a mosque in Peshawar. So just attack after attack. It seems like every couple of days, or at least every 48 hours, if not more frequent than that, there's an attack either in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Asfandyar, I'm wondering if you can give viewers kind of a overview of these groups. What is the TTP? What is ISK? How do they relate to Al-Qaeda? How does TTP relate to the Afghan Taliban? How does ISK relate to the Afghan Taliban? There's a lot of acronyms at play. There's a lot of crossover between some of these groups. If you can just give an overview.
Thanks so much, Adam, for having me on, and delighted to be here and to be a part of this August group. Let me focus on the terror landscape in both of these countries and give you a sense of the trajectories of the major group. The bottom line is that the terror landscape is aggravating at a steady rate. Several groups which were um, in Afghanistan and Pakistan remain there and continue to gain with the period of time. So let's start with Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda is resilient in Afghanistan, in my assessment, and that's in large part due to the Taliban's support. To be sure, there is no massive expansion of the group in these last 8 months, but there is a substantial presence of this group. Most indicators suggest a continued presence of elements of not just Al Qaeda's South Asian affiliate, but also the core group. And I think most recent assessments indicate that Ayman al-Zawahiri, the Al Qaeda chief, might still be in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. Then turning to ISIS-K, this is a group that I think a lot of us. I was paying attention to it for many years, but I think it really came into focus, international focus, after the attack at the airport in August 2021. And ISIS-K specifically has adapted to the Taliban's return. We now see that ISIS-K is leveraging anti-Taliban sentiment in general, and in sectarian Salafi constituencies in parts of Afghanistan, particularly in the north and eastern provinces, to its advantage and benefit. The Taliban have mounted a crackdown against ISIS-K, but their tactics are indiscriminate and wavered. They are turning to collective punishment type tactics, repression, in particular of the Salafi communities in the east of the country, in Kabul, which I believe is alienating people and pushing more people towards ISIS-K. ISIS-K's leader, Shahab al-Muhajir, is effective. He's a terrorist mastermind, undoubtedly, and he appears to have foregone territorial control for undertaking major violent attacks. And his strategy appears to be what I call outbidding violence, spectacular, horrific violence to demonstrate that the Taliban cannot secure Afghanistan. So I think, going forward, he will try to target Taliban senior leaders, religious and ethnic minorities, as well as carry out cross-border attacks, which sort of demonstrate his range. And we've already seen attacks by ISIS-K, both in Pakistan and a recent one in Uzbekistan. Then turning to the anti-Pakistan militancy, which I believe is the biggest beneficiary of the Taliban's takeover. Anti-Pakistan militants, part of the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, has a strong, very conducive haven in Afghanistan, and threats to Pakistan are really growing. Taliban are politically advocating for the TTP before the Pakistani government. They're pressing the Pakistani government to make concessions to the TTP. The Taliban are also materially helping the TTP along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. And for its part, TTP is using this permissive environment to build what I believe is a war machine for a long-term attritional campaign in Pakistan. TTP has stepped up its cross-border attacks, which have been bleeding Pakistani security forces. It is also now regularly crossing over fighters into Pakistan, including fighters who were previously associated with the Afghan Taliban. So, put another way, Afghan Taliban rank and file may be joining the ranks of the TTP, which I think is a very troubling development. I want to conclude with the militancy that I think we haven't spoken about much in the public domain over the last 8 months, which is anti-India militancy, and that has had a presence in Afghanistan. So two groups that I continue to watch are Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. They still have a presence in Afghanistan, remain in Afghanistan, and signs are that the Taliban continue to accommodate them. Most troubling, however, from an anti-India militancy point of view, is Al Qaeda's messaging, which has been focusing on India a lot since the Taliban's takeover.
Thanks for all of that. I think it's a lot to take in, but it was an excellent summary. And on your last point about the anti-India violence, I do think some people who don't focus on South Asia, especially if they're based in the United States, might say, okay, so what, not our problem. But the reason it's concerning, I think, from a US perspective is that I think we forget that all it takes is one terrorist attack, especially a large scale one inside India, to exponentially raise tensions between India and Pakistan, which are both nuclear powers. And before the crisis in Ukraine, and I'm sure Elizabeth has far more expertise on the nuclear environment in South Asia, but before the crisis in Ukraine, I think most people agreed that the most likely place for a potential nuclear exchange was South Asia. And this is why it's so concerning that there are terrorist groups that are again focusing on India from this region. In terms of security in Pakistan, I've always been one who thinks, sometimes in the United States we engage in a little bit of hyperbole about how insecure Pakistan is, and of course the height of insecurity was, in the early 2010s. And since then, we did see terrorism decline, but now it's starting to spike again. I will say that what's happened in the last month concerns even me, someone who thinks that Washington analysts often engage in hyperbole. We are seeing an incredible amount of violence in Pakistan by Baluch separatist groups, by the TTP, by ISK. And it is deeply concerning. I think there might be a bit of denial in both Islamabad and Washington over how serious the situation is. I want to bring in Elizabeth to talk about what are the implications of this violence on US-Pakistan relations. You were in Peshawar at a time that I think the city was quite insecure. So you've witnessed violent phases in Pakistan before. What do you think it means for US-Pakistan relations now?
Well, thanks for the question, Adam. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Thanks for joining us, to the audience, and to my fellow panelists as well. I would agree with that assessment. There are really troubling signs on the security front at a time when Pakistan's own political situation is still evolving. Of course, we saw the change of government in Pakistan in recent weeks with Imran Khan's departure and the arrival of Shehbaz Sharif. There's also going to be a transition in Pakistan's Chief of Army Staff, a hugely important position in the country later this year. So I think it's safe to say that this is a time of flux in Pakistan, and the security situation is only adding to that uncertainty. Obviously, zooming out a little bit more, we had the Taliban takeover last August. And at the time, I and others, including many on this panel, predicted that we would see spillover effects within Pakistan. And I think that is playing out, but that's not the full story. Asfandyar did a great job of kind of unpacking the internal dynamics of these groups as well. In terms of US-Pakistan relations right now, I referred to the transition in prime minister, and that was obviously something that was closely watched here in Washington. But the former prime minister Imran Khan alleged that there was a US conspiracy to unseat him, unfounded claims that Pakistan's own security establishment has come out to deny at this point. But nonetheless, I think that sets the stage for some challenges in US-Pakistan relations, but by the same token, we have a new prime minister. Perhaps this is an opportunity. At the same point, though, the US in general is focused on the China challenge, is focused on deepening ties with India, and that creates a tension in the relationship. So I think going forward, the question to ask is, how severe is the security threat along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border? And what does that mean for any potential counterterrorism cooperation going forward? Because the last time that Pakistan was in this sort of situation where there were large-scale attacks repeated, and in fact, Pakistan had to launch a full-scale military operation along the border. The U.S. was there through its involvement in Afghanistan, and there was coordination on the CT front. So I think going forward at a time when that is no longer the case, certainly to that extent, and there are questions about what sort of cooperation will be possible going forward, that is an additional dynamic here that I don't think has been properly anticipated or properly appreciated.
So we're going to get back to the CT cooperation a little bit later, and I think that's an important question that I'm going to hold on to. I want to ask Asfandyar a quick follow-up. It strikes me that perhaps one of Washington's biggest delusions in Afghanistan was the idea that it could simply excise the Taliban as part of Afghan society and just remove them, and this was the approach we could take and everything would be okay. And if there was and I think over time, especially in the latter years of the war, that kind of delusion was revealed and people believed it less, but at least during the surge, I think it was something that was a belief that was widely held in Washington. If there was a delusion on the part of Islamabad, I think it was, or shall we say, shall we also say Rawalpindi? I think it was the belief that TTP or the Afghan Taliban could be convinced to control TTP. Do you agree with that assessment, Asfandyar, and to what extent?
Sure. So I think one lesson which Pakistan should have learned over the last decade, but didn't, was that the TTP thrives on the Afghan Taliban's support and example. And that if the Taliban gain in strength in Afghanistan, the TTP will gain as well. Pakistan not only didn't learn this lesson, it actively sort of obfuscated the reality of the TTP. So officials of the former government, the Imran Khan government, offered what I believe were absurd diagnoses on the drivers of the TTP. And when the Pakistani government should have been pressing the Taliban for more clarity on the TTP question, at that time, officials were running cover for the Taliban, effectively shielding them from the U.S. government, and instead framing the TTP as being driven by the Afghan Republic and India. There's a lot of water under the bridge at this time, but I think any new Pakistani strategy to counter the TTP, and it's becoming a really massive problem. Pakistan carried out airstrikes recently against suspected TTP hideouts, which appeared to have, those strikes have gone wrong, killed a lot of civilians. I think that suggests the problem is deepening with each passing day. And if Pakistan wants a new strategy, it has to start by rethinking its policy towards the Taliban.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about the Afghan Taliban themselves. The Afghan Taliban today have tensions with their Pakistani neighbor. They have tensions with Iran. Both Iran and Pakistan are moving, or either actively engaged in military incursions into Afghan territory, or in the case of Iran, have moved tanks, I think, towards the border. Of course, this is not completely new. These tensions existed during the time of the Republic as well, but it's certainly not good for the Taliban. Meanwhile, ISK is targeting Afghanistan's Hazara population, and it seems that there's both a sectarian religious component and an ethnic component. Again, not new. The Hazaras were disproportionately targeted during the time of the Republic, even when the U.S. military was in Afghanistan. But the Taliban have proved unable to control that kind of violence. And on top of it, ISK is targeting the Taliban itself. And you hear about attacks on Taliban checkpoints, and especially in Nangarhar, which is an ISK stronghold. Tamim, I'm wondering if you could tell us from an Afghan perspective, what is the environment for Afghans right now in terms of ISK and the Taliban, and what is the ISK threat to the Taliban, and how are the Taliban responding to that threat, either positively or negatively?
Thank you, Adam. Just to quickly answer your question, it's a pleasure and honor to be amongst this panel, and a lot of good friends, Asfandyar, John, Elizabeth, everybody. First, the relationship of the Taliban with the ISKP has been not so black and white. It has been defined by 3 C's, which is essentially cooperation, conflict, and competition. The cooperation phase was when ISKP was being set up in Afghanistan, and Azizullah Haqqani, which is one of the cousins of Siraj Haqqani, played a very important role in setting up the base of ISKP in eastern Afghanistan. So the Haqqanis were one of the fundamental founders of ISKP and the enablers of ISKP back in 2014-15. And this is very well documented by Antonio Gistosi, people who have been following this thing very closely. Then competition has come when ISKP started challenging the rank and file of the Taliban. Because the rank and file of the Taliban today, and also yesterday when the Americans were present and NATO was present there, was quite extremist members. And it was always who is Muslim good enough and who was more extreme. And that is why the Taliban leadership are very, very careful and very cognizant of the fact that there are possibilities of switching flags, switching has been tactical cooperations in various places between the Taliban and between the ISKP. Now, the final thing when it comes to confrontation, yes, Taliban have confronted the ISKP threat in Afghanistan heads on when they took over power, but then they also went when they took over power, they also had an open door prison policy, whereas they opened up the prison's gates and all of these high-profile ISKP prisoners and others escaped. And that gave a boost to the urban ISKP cells, the sleeper cells. And that's why you see a lot of these attacks right now that is happening. So essentially that has been mired between the 3 C's. Somewhere they have cooperation, some places they have conflicts, some places they have competition. But yes, Taliban have gone against the ISKP post August 15th, very heads-on, carried out beheadings, carried out very brutal repressions against the ISKP. Would that mean that they are completely against it? I don't think so, because the ISKP members who are Haqqani friendly, they're either coming and switching sides or they're living under the protection umbrella of the Haqqanis. Just recently, if you look at one of the ISKP leaders in Jalalabad came and submitted himself to the Taliban, basically gave up fighting, turned himself over to the NDS directorate in Jalalabad and Nangarhar. And the only reason was that Khalil Haqqani, which is the current minister of refugees of Afghanistan, had a back channel negotiations for him to be able to switch side. So I think we need to be cognizant of some of those things. And it's not really black and white that Taliban is completely against ISKP or ISKP is completely. There is that symbiotic relationship and it will continue to be there.
So to summarize what you've said in US military jargon, ISK at one point was a force multiplier for the Taliban. And I think in some cases, it gave the Taliban plausible deniability, especially during the Doha negotiations. We saw this spike in violence. Nobody was claiming the violence. I think there was, in some sense, it was beneficial to the Taliban to have a very insecure environment, and it was nice for them to have ISK for plausible deniability, and so there were so many Afghan victims who never really got closure because it was unclear exactly who was killing them, and it was probably both groups. But now that the Taliban have power, ISK, they're in competition with ISK, but there are still some elements of the Taliban that have links to ISK through back channels. I want to bring in John here because for years you've examined the Al-Qaeda threat, and you've also done really deep dives into what went wrong for the Afghan security forces, or the ANDSF. Do you see any of those mistakes being repeated by the Taliban? Do you see the Taliban learning any of the lessons of the ANDSF, while recognizing that these are two very different entities? And how would you assess the threat environment in Afghanistan from a US perspective? So maybe first answer whether you think the Taliban have internalized any of the lessons of the ANDSF, and second, what is the threat environment from a US perspective?
Yeah, no, those are good questions. And thanks, Adam, for having me on the panel with such an august group of participants. I really enjoy hearing from everyone else here. I'm going to learn far more than I'm probably going to share. On your question, what you asked me is, have they internalized any of the lessons of what happened with the Afghan security forces? And I would say in order to do that, they would first have to study and learn them. And I'm not convinced that they've done that at all. In fact, I would submit that the Taliban, the position that they might take on that is similar to a position that they take on a lot of these issues, which is to say, they won. They defeated the Afghan security forces. The Afghan security forces failed, miserably, collapsed. So what lessons could they possibly learn from that experience, right? I mean, there is a certain hubris that the Taliban exude on these types of issues that I think would preclude them from engaging in the type of deliberate study of what went well or otherwise with the Afghan security forces and what should they take away from that. So that's a long answer. The short answer is no. I don't think they've internalized any of those lessons, nor do I think they intend to even attempt to understand what those lessons might be. As I look at what the Taliban are doing, though, I would say, they're engaging in some of the same mistakes that Afghan security forces made, and certainly that U.S. forces made, in terms of being, heavy-handed at times, not being discriminate enough in the use of violence, engendering blowback from civilian casualties and mistreatment of local populations, not providing adequate protection to, especially the most vulnerable of Afghanistan's peoples. These are mistakes that were made under the time of the Republic as well. And the Taliban are making them again. And so that's sort of, I think, the answer I would give to your first question. On the second, can you remind me of your second question again? I'm sorry, I should have written it down.
The second question was, from a U.S. perspective, what do you think is the current threat environment emanating from Afghanistan, and how should we prioritize it?
Yeah, thanks for the reminder. I was working on a paper yesterday, and I went back and reread some U.S. government official, comments and testimonies in the immediate wake of the collapse of the Republic. And I was reminded that Undersecretary of Defense Colin Kahl, when he testified in October, was asked, how long do you think it would take before ISK or Al Qaeda would, regain the ability to attack outside of Afghanistan? And his estimate for ISIS was 6 to 12 months, and that was in October. And so we have just entered that window now of 6 to 12 months. And it's interesting to me that in that time, we're sort of at the front end of that window, excuse me, and over the last month, as Asfandyar noted, we have seen an attack. We have seen attacks now of ISIS-K outside of Afghanistan, in both Pakistan and Uzbekistan. And now, while that may not be concerning to average Americans, or potentially even to American officials who are obviously more concerned with U.S. allies and U.S. positions overseas, and certainly the U.S. homeland, That trend is nonetheless concerning in terms of ISIS's of not only their ability to attack externally, but their now demonstrated willingness to do that, to open up, the possibility of sowing chaos beyond Afghanistan's borders, which is in their interest to do in a lot of ways, right? The more they can undermine the Taliban, both internally and undermine it externally, and potentially open up seams of discontent between the Taliban and regional governments, all of that, right? These groups thrive in chaotic environments. So the more that they can foment that kind of, dissatisfaction, distrust, and ultimately chaos within the region, I think that is concerning to the U.S. I mean, we're far from, or at least hopefully far from something, that looks like what we saw in Iraq and Syria occurring in South Asia. But certainly, if you were to sit down and map out what do you think indications and warnings of trends in that direction would be, regional attacks by the likes of the Islamic State would be one of those indications and warning. So again, not to be hyperbolic, to use your point about it, but it is concerning.
Tamim, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Just quickly, three things. First, the ISKP have a lot of cash money, and it's I don't know where it comes from, but the salary that they are offering to the fighters and to the operators is mind-boggling if you compare it to the local incentives that either the Taliban or any other forces offer to their fighters for only maybe 2 to 3 operations in a month. And I'm sorry to be putting it so bluntly. So it's 48,000 AFs for a month, which is a lot of money locally. And that money is something that a lot of us researchers and others are looking into and finding out where do they get that. That's one. So there's a lot of attraction based on the disenchantment, but also the financial incentives that exist. The second thing about the ISKP that's why it's getting the thriving is there, especially with their attacks, is the urban ISKP versus the rural ISKP. Yes, the Taliban have been taking very brutal punitive actions against the Taliban in rural Afghanistan, specifically in the east, but the sleeping cellular cells of the ISKP inside major cities of Afghanistan is very much alive and well, and they're very active, and that's why you see all these major attacks on soft targets, so as to say. And the final thing, which I thought was really important to be brought up when it comes to the ISKP right now in Afghanistan, is for various reasons. Now, some of it is mired by conspiracy theories, but some of it has actually a lot of ground, is that you see a lot of intelligence projects, covers, which are operating for infiltration reasons. Now, there are lots of talks locally, if you talk, that ISKP is just a name and a brand and an address that the intelligence agencies within the region use to infiltrate the Islamic extremist network and ecosystem and environment within Afghanistan. And I think we have to be very careful which ISKP we are talking about. Is it really the ideological one? Is it really the cover-ups? Is it really the infiltration projects that exist? And the folks I talk to in Afghanistan, a lot of them suspect that these operations are carried out by different groups within Afghanistan to attract attention for infiltration reasons, but also to present ISKP as an alternative to the Taliban.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And you also at least partially answered one of the questions in the chat, which was about the funding model of some of these groups, although as we know, it's opaque in many ways. I want to switch gears for a moment because there are even other panelists on this panel who were supportive of a withdrawal and felt that there are other threats that the United States faces. And regardless of one's position on the withdrawal, I think everyone can recognize that there's existential threats like climate change, there's other threats, state-to-state threats, there's all kinds of other issues that take up Washington's bandwidth. And I think some had hoped that leaving Afghanistan militarily would perhaps lead to a healthier relationship with the region, and perhaps U.S.-Pakistan relations could be improved if they weren't held hostage, so to speak, by differing views on what should happen in Afghanistan. And yet we still see that these security concerns, this rising violence in Pakistan, the high rates of violence in Afghanistan remain center to how we talk about this region. So I want to explore the question of how can the United States and countries in the region deal with this threat and learn the lessons of GWAT. And I want to open it by, giving some context about TTP. One might ask, why would Pakistan want to partner with the US on counterterrorism? And I guess what I would say is, well, it was US drones that killed two of TTP's leaders. And so in some sense that had a benefit for the Pakistani state. But I also want to place it in some other perspective. And these are figures from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism that were cited in a book. Under of the 2,379 drone deaths in Pakistan, only 84 of those deaths were identified as members of Al-Qaeda. And projected civilian deaths were 424 to 969. Projected children killed were 172 to 207. Now, of course, different auditors, so to speak, have had projected different figures. But no matter whose figures you look at, they're dismal. A lot of civilians were killed in strikes. And it strikes me that TTP and ISK have adapted quite well to losing their leaders. It's questionable what effect killing a TTP leader or an ISK leader has had on these organizations' ability to revitalize themselves and come back even stronger. But of course, if any panelists disagree, I'd like to hear it. So I want to go back to you, John. Are there, without repeating some of the mistakes of the war on terror, are there creative ways that the United States can work with the region to try to curtail these threats while keeping in mind that all threats have to be prioritized and not just viewed in a silo or in a vacuum?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Something I'm working on a paper right now that sort of follows in the wake of a paper that Seth Jones published with the Council on Foreign Relations a few days ago. So he offered 3 ideas in that paper, which were effectively, what I would describe as traditionalist ideas for trying to expand on the US counterterrorism approach, right? One had to do with rebuilding covert intelligence networks inside Afghanistan, trying to negotiate basing access for US drones closer to Afghanistan, so either in Pakistan or a Central Asian state, and just trying to get better location and access to the country. So he sort of offered those ideas. Those are good ideas. Again, they're sort of very traditional ones that the US has pursued in the past as well. There are some additional things I think that could be, tried to expand the suite of options even further, right? So one of the biggest problems that you have with this type of counterterrorism approach is what you described, right? Even if you're using drones are effectively an over-the-horizon approach to countering terrorism. And then for them to hit the targets that you intend to hit, you have to have really, really high quality intelligence on the locations of specific people that you want to target, and not just their locations, but when are they going to be there? Who is going to be there with them? Are you going to cause collateral damage? Are you going to get a clean shot at the target you want to hit? I mean, all of these things, right, require exquisite amounts of highly detailed information. So one of the best things the US could do is to try and get better information. And some of Seth's recommendations, right, a covert intelligence network, for example, are designed to get after that. But there are other things that one could do to try and do better, right? One is the use of cyber tools. So there are plenty of Wi-Fi networks and cell phone users in Afghanistan, and the U.S. has fairly exquisite tools to operate on cyber networks and to harvest information that way. And that is a tool that could be used. I don't know. I don't have any insider information to the extent at which the U.S. is using those tools now, but it has them, and it could potentially use them in more fulsome fashion going forward than I assume it has in the past, or at least the past 6 months. So that's an option. Another would be open source information collection, right? So, the World Bank says roughly 58% of Afghan citizens have a cell phone subscription, and it's, I think, a fair assumption that many of them are using social media apps on those. In fact, it looks like a recent trend in the wake of the Taliban's takeover is that Facebook has become by far and away the dominant social media platform in Afghanistan, whereas Twitter was beforehand. And so there's a lot of open source information that one could be harvesting deliberately and analyzing to try and identify, the locations or at least indications of, the likes of Islamic State operatives and those types of things. So there are these types of approaches that the U.S. could invest more in to try and get better information, even without a presence on the ground in Afghanistan, overtly or covert. These are, you could call them over the horizon information gathering techniques. Another thought I'll just offer quickly is, given that we've now seen the Islamic State from its locations in Afghanistan attacking regionally, for example, this attack in Uzbekistan, attacks in Pakistan, et cetera, that opens the door potentially for engagements with these regional countries about various forms of security cooperation. And while it's tempting to jump straight to the idea of negotiating a drone base in Pakistan, either overtly or covertly as we had before, or trying to do that in one of the Central Asian states as the US was trying to negotiate even before it withdrew from Afghanistan, my point of view is, look, we did counterterrorism in Afghanistan for the last 20 years with very mixed results. It is, given the resiliency of these groups, as you alluded to, I think it is folly to assume that the US will be conducting over the horizon counterterrorism in Afghanistan for anything less than another 20 years. I mean, these are generational problems. We should think of them in generational time frames. So rather than going to Uzbekistan or Pakistan and saying, hey, there was this ISK attack on your territory, let us have a drone base here. Let's start with something that's smaller, more incremental, and more valuable to these countries. So for example, you can engage Uzbekistan and say, look, understanding that containing the ISK problem in Afghanistan is of interest to you, can we help you with border security? Right? Can we help train your border guards? Can we help provide you with equipment that will allow you to see and patrol your own border better than you are able to do now? Right? Start small, and over time build a relationship of trust, a toehold of access, and hope that you can expand on that over time. You may or may not ever get to the point where that toehold of access expands to the level of a drone base in a Central Asian state. But it doesn't make sense if you take a 20-year view of the problem to not try and hold open the possibility of getting to that level of relationship.
Yeah, and if I could give two quick reactions. I mean, I'm a big proponent of capacity building. I actually think what success would look like is being able to help these regional countries improve their capacity to the point where having US troops in the country simply just doesn't make sense, rather than leading to a relationship of trust that allows that to happen. I actually think it'd be better if we focused on capacity building. And on the topic, which you correctly said, to get a drone strike right, so to speak, it requires a lot of intel. And I think we need to have a lot of humility as a country. Pakistan just seemingly killed a bunch of civilians, including children, in Afghanistan. And Pakistan, in its strike on alleged TTP militants. And Pakistan is linguistically, culturally, geographically better placed to collect that kind of intelligence in many ways than I think the United States could ever dream of being. And yet Pakistan just got it wrong. So I think we need to have a lot of humility about what is the utility of these strikes? Are we producing more militants than we're taking out? Does it really matter for these groups if we eliminate high value targets? And with that, I'd like to transition to Elizabeth to ask you, from a diplomatic perspective, how does the U.S. engage with Pakistan? Perhaps how does the U.S. engage with Taliban? How does the U.S. engage with a region that has really felt the repercussions of the U.S. war on terror? I think you spoke about Imran Khan's use of anti-American narratives, but I think we have to also remember that we've made that possible because this is a part of the world that has really felt the aftershock of the U.S. war in Afghanistan, not just in Afghanistan, but in neighboring countries as well. So what are the diplomatic priorities for the United States in the region right now?
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, just really briefly on the drone question specifically, since it's come up a number of times. By no means a proponent of that, but I think one just interesting data point for what it's worth is that when I was in Pakistan, speaking to folks from what was then FATA, the Afghan border region, there was actually a pretty widespread, quiet acknowledgement that drone strikes had been helpful in taking out certain high value targets. That is anecdotal. There is actually some academic research that's being done right now to look at this question. So I guess watch the space going forward. But I think the narrative there in Islamabad in particular, and kind of in the big cities versus the areas where these attacks were ongoing, there was a delta. And I think it's important to keep that in mind just in terms of local experiences. Obviously, there were also horrible mistakes that were made. There, the word in Pashto for drone is bee, like the buzzing sound of the bee, at least in these areas, right? And so it is something that had an enormous impact on the civilian populations. And so I think it's right to be a little to be aware, to be humble about U.S. capabilities in that context, and to recognize the regional environment in which we find ourselves. So, to my mind, this is exactly where diplomacy comes in. And it is especially challenging to do that in a context where the U.S. doesn't recognize the Taliban, where those contacts are difficult. And quite frankly, there are a number of different concerns that the U.S. is having to work through in that relationship. On the Pakistan side, I think here is where the Pakistan-Afghanistan relationship is so critical. You mentioned the strike across the border. We've seen upwards of 100 Pakistani security forces killed in attacks in recent days. So this is of critical importance right now in Pakistan. And I think there are demand signals that are coming in for a greater appreciation of the threat, particularly now. I will say, I know we're not getting into that, but with the attack at Karachi University this morning, that's going to bring the terrorist threat back up to the front pages of newspapers. So, going forward in terms of engagement, I think it is a process of not assuming an answer before we have a conversation, probably having those conversations quietly, and looking at where that mix of capabilities and kind of human intelligence is to be able to look at this threat. And the last thing I'll say, though, is I think it's important to keep in mind how wildly the Pakistan government itself has vacillated in its approach to these groups. So we used to have the conversation about talking and fighting with the Taliban in Afghanistan, and it's a similar dynamic that's actually playing out between Pakistan and the TTP. There have been a few rounds of negotiations, including one purported ceasefire that broke down pretty quickly thereafter. I saw a question in the Q&A about, is that is that going to come back on the agenda of the government? I don't know the answer to that question, but Pakistan seems to be grasping at straws to an extent, because on the one hand, there are negotiations going on. Pakistan has called for the Afghan government to take action against this group. We saw news that Taliban have at least move anti-Pakistan groups further away from the border. That seems to be kind of the strategy for now. But according to news reports, it was pretty widely acknowledged that that is not going to be a long-term solution to this problem. So, I wish I had that solution to look at this, but I think diplomacy is key here, and engaging with the threat as it exists, rather than, as I said, presupposing the solution from what we have tried previously.
Yeah, and when it comes to engaging with the threat as it exists, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that I think the threat has been traditionally inflated compared to other threats by a lot, but I also think it's important to keep in mind that, we can't pretend it doesn't exist either, because it can have ramifications that are much, much bigger for the region, especially in the case of the anti-India groups. I wanted to do one quick follow-up with you, because you mentioned the attack in Karachi, which killed Chinese nationals. And of course, Pakistan is the most dangerous destination for Chinese overseas workers, even though Pakistan and China have a very close relationship. It's just a fact that because of the closeness of that relationship, groups that seek to cause problems for the Pakistani state see value in targeting Chinese nationals. Do you think there's any room for regional and even U.S. engagement with China on the question of CT? I think we've seen that China has very little interest in development in Afghanistan, at least. I don't think they're going to be building any mines anytime soon for logistical reasons. They've repeatedly demonstrated that they have, the sums of money that China has provided to Afghanistan, I think, have been pitifully small in terms of aid. So they don't have an interest in aid. But is there an overlap when it comes to CT interests?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear what other panelists have to say on this as well. But, I think that diplomacy is ongoing to an extent. We've seen a continuation of a series of meetings with the extended troika, most recently in China, right? So the U.S. participated in that. So there is a forum to have conversations specifically on the Afghanistan piece. I would imagine CT is a part of that, but specifically on Pakistan, I don't get the sense that there is a great deal of interest on the Chinese side in having those sorts of conversations with the US. China obviously has a very close relationship with Pakistan, with its military establishment. And I would imagine that, there are going to be yet more conversations and assurances that Chinese nationals will be secure in Pakistan. What we do have, though, is an overlap of interest to an extent that neither the US nor China is interested in seeing a continuation of this spillover violence. So, there are a few areas of overlapping interest between the US and China these days. And so even if that's not an active conversation, I think it is important to look at what strategies could be out there, what those roles are. And just very briefly, since I'm so glad Asfandyar brought this up, the risk of anti-India groups and an attack that could spark a broader regional crisis, specifically between India and Pakistan, depending on how things play out. The role of third-party crisis managers is key in any situation along those lines. And so I think it's vitally important for the US and China to recognize that and recognize the challenges that their competition brings to traditional roles that both sides have played in trying to encourage de-escalation in regional crises.
I think that the last point you made is really important. So I hope everyone paid attention to it. Asfandyar, let me bring you in for a moment. You raised your hand earlier. So whatever you want to say, please say. But I also want to ask, what is the Pakistani state facing right now? if you can really summarize it. And United States and Pakistan always, in their talking points say, well, this is a security partnership that is tried and tested and so forth. It seems like it's going to remain security based for a while, even though, the previous government in Pakistan wanted a so-called geoeconomic reset. What is Pakistan up against, and how can the United States support security in the region, either through diplomacy, development, or capacity building?
Sure. So my sense is that Pakistan is facing a rapidly growing internal security problem. It should have been anticipated. I think it was predictable. I think once the Taliban ascended to power in Kabul, it was clear at that time that anti-Pakistan militancy was going to get a major impetus. And sadly, unfortunately, I think just 8 months out from the Taliban's takeover, we are seeing the threat against Pakistan metastasize the most compared to all other threats that are emanating from Afghanistan. So given that, I think the first order question that Washington has to confront is that, should it even care about the counterterrorism situation in Pakistan, given the administration's stated pivot of sorts from the region, that it wants to focus on great power competition and politics, and this part of the world in many ways is peripheral to that broader strategic focus. My contention would be that Washington should be watching the CT situation in the region in general and in Pakistan in particular closely. I am on board with the idea that all terrorism everywhere is not the problem of the United States government, and that US counterterrorism resources and attention, especially these days and going forward, have to be channeled more carefully and judiciously. But the trend lines in Pakistan, trend lines in Afghanistan next door, I think, are negative. And in fact, they're trending in a direction where even a minimally defined US national security agenda for the region, say something that focuses on nuclear security, prevention of transnational and regionally focused terrorist threats, I think this agenda is going to be affected by some of these threats. Of course, we're not there yet, but my concern is that we won't know easily when we're there. I think Washington probably has to identify some clear thresholds beyond which the CT situation in the region is a concern for them, and I think there can be markers such as levels of violence, the targeting choices of some of these groups, their territorial influence. I think that there have to be clear thresholds of some of those things. And in terms of areas where the US can support, say, Pakistan, it's difficult to work with the Taliban, but even the question of working with Pakistan on terrorism, counterterrorism is a tenuous one. And my position as of now is that the US should engage Pakistan on the Taliban question and explore if there is more political alignment today on pressing the Taliban on counterterrorism. Because I'm starting to sense some real frustration on part of Pakistan towards the Taliban, in particular due to its support for the TTP. I don't think Pakistan is going to turn around on the Taliban swiftly or anytime soon, but I think there is an opening which should be explored. And in terms of capacity, one area where I think the US government should really talk to Pakistan is on its targeting capability. The US government has killed plenty of civilians in airstrikes for sure over a period of time, but it also improved processes, created a system of sorts, and so there are important lessons there. So my sense is it might be time to check in on Pakistan's targeting system, in particular if American weapon systems are going to be used in some of these cross-border raids, such as the F-16s. and see if the US can do something to augment Pakistan's capacity. We should not want more civilians to die in Pakistani targeting on either side of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border.
Yeah, so on that last point, I mean, yeah, it would be a real tragedy if the US delegated CT to these regional countries, as I think it should, but then didn't demand responsibility from these regional countries themselves when it comes to targeting and mitigating civilian casualties, especially as you point out that Pakistan is using weapons systems provided by the US. I know we're at time. I'm definitely going to bring in Tamim for a moment. For those of you who can stay a couple minutes over, I just want to pitch our next event, since we're talking about South Asia, which is a discussion between Sarang Shador, who is the director of studies at the Quincy Institute, and Shiv Shankar Menon, who was a former ambassador, Shiv Shankar Menon, I should say, who's currently visiting professor at Ashoka University in India. And they're going to have a discussion about where does South Asia fall in great power rivalry between the US and China and the US and Russia. These developments in Russia have, I think, really put this topic into the spotlight. So please join that discussion. It will be May 3rd at 10 a.m. And it is also a Zoom webinar. And I will try to place it in the chat here if I can, so that everyone can see, panelists and attendees. So just follow that link if you're still with us and register today. I promise you it's going to be a thought-provocative discussion. Tamim, you've had your hand up for a while. We're a couple minutes over, but I still see a lot of people have stayed on. So if you could, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. Just quickly to say that the region, and specifically Pakistan, is suffering from the Frankenstein that they have built for themselves. I mean, if you look, there was a very good article written by Antonio the other day or 2 months ago, The Unhappy Friends of Taliban. When we were in the government, the Afghan government, and also the US military officers and others kept telling Taliban in the region that the threat is there, that the Taliban is an umbrella group. It's just a matter of time that if they take over, there will be credible national security threats to you. And today, Pakistan is suffering from a self-inflicted wound, sadly. And from the Frankenstein, not only Pakistan, it's Iran. I mean, Taliban is now on a collusion course with all of Afghan neighbors, with Iran. Iran just deployed tanks and stuff on its borders for the first time after the Republic. Pakistan has been losing to the tune of 200. I was looking at some statistics of soldiers since Taliban took over, including some generals. Uzbekistan getting attacked. Tajikistan is getting attacked. And this is why this myth of Taliban not having a global agenda, that these are very local people and they've been fighting, that is being demystified. And sadly, I think it's a time bomb. It's a matter of time before this particular militant Islam landscape starts planning attacks. They're already planning attacks or doing some attacks, showing some actions in the region. It's a matter of time before they do something in Europe or beyond, sadly. And it's a repetition of history. It's a history that is being repeated at the cost of abandonment of Afghanistan and turning it into a safe haven for various Islamic militants. Now, Pakistan have always been pursuing export of jihadism policy to Afghanistan. I've sat down with Pakistan military officers who consistently have told us that it's not our war, that we don't want to transfer the geography of war inside of Pakistan. And you know what? Now Taliban are in power, and the geography of war is coming to the Pakistani city, sadly, and it's very tragic. But it is because of the miscalculated policies of the Pakistani establishment, which the Frankenstein and the snake that they have been nurturing as an instrument of foreign policy on its neighbors is biting back.
I want to give one follow-up question to you, because we still have a lot of the original people are still listening. In terms of U.S. policy towards the region. You've said a number of times that you don't think the Taliban can last unless they make real changes. Now, this could be measured in years or decades, definitely not months, and probably not just a few years. But the Taliban are either going to have to evolve or they're going to be replaced because of the way they're interacting with Afghan society. And I've heard you make this point in several different fora. Then to what end, how should the U.S. prevent Afghanistan from becoming a failed state? So that either an evolved Taliban, if that's even possible, or a future government doesn't assume power over a state that has lost all of the gains of the last 2 decades in terms of health and infrastructure and things like this.
Well, the US is doing what it does best, repeat history. In 1990s, it abandoned and regionalized the Afghan problem. They're doing the same thing, abandon and regionalize the Afghan problem. That's one. Secondly, what the US could do at this stage, I don't see any appetite in the US or the West to engage in any major way in Afghanistan because of the scars of the past 2 decades. But I think what will happen is the US will react when it's actually hurt. And I'm sorry to say this, and General Bajwa, I know, have said this. I know others have said this. It's just a matter of time that you will see another 9/11 style attacks either in Europe or US, and then the US will wake up and say, well, we did something wrong. This is why we have been consistently warning the US and others. And at that time, they would say, oh, these are Afghan Republic officials and others, and they're saying this thing to stay in power, prolong their power. That wasn't the case. Their own security, intelligence, and military officers kept telling them, you ignore Afghanistan at your own peril. If you don't fight these people in Afghanistan, you have to fight them on the streets of Europe and Washington, sadly. And I'm very, it is astonishing to me that is falling on deaf ear, and then I am very sad to see that this is actually getting escalated, and it's playing out as many of us in our worst fears estimated that. With attacks on Uzbekistan, with all the confrontations, and then the Taliban still functioning as an umbrella organization. The Taliban still harbors and entertains foreign fighters, including Al-Qaeda and regional terror fighters, which some of them are actually encouraging these regional confrontations because of their global jihad plea. And then you might see attacks being planned as we speak. And as John was mentioning about the Undersecretary of Defense saying 6 months to a year, it's a matter of time before they do something. So I think US is just repeating history, and over the horizon CT has never really worked. It a lot depends on good intelligence on the ground and how you would do it. And that is actually missing right now. And counting on the Taliban to take over terrorism is like, it's just a no-go, and the 8 months have shown that.
Well, thank you for your remarks. The only reaction I would have is that I think over the horizon tactics didn't quite work even when they weren't over the horizon, even when they were on the horizon. So I'll be looking forward to reading John's brief about out-of-the-box thinking that tries to bring in some of the lessons of the last 20 years and not repeat all of the mistakes and sort of right size how we approach this threat that everyone agrees exists, but many of our tactics have not solved and have hurt many in the process. So with that, I'd like to thank all of the panelists, and I hope we answered some of the questions in the Q&A. I think we at least answered a couple. And thanks to all the participants who have stayed on over time. And please sign up for the discussion on May 3rd about where South Asia falls amid great power rivalries. It's somewhat caught between a rock and a hard place, I think. So thank you for all of those who